She has a rare talent, turning corporate silence into romantic chaos in under a minute. One comment, one gesture, one burst of indignation, and suddenly she has the attention of the coldest, most controlled CEO in the building. The twist? Instead of scolding her, he reacts in a way he doesn't even understand. Cassidy Whitlock had exactly 3 talents in life: organizing spreadsheets with surgical precision, defending fictional love stories as though they were constitutional rights, and saying the wrong thing at the worst possible time. Today, she would exercise all 3 before 9 in the morning. The executive floor break room at Reed & Associates was a place Cassidy did not belong. She worked 2 floors down, in the administrative department, surrounded by filing cabinets and fluorescent lights that flickered every Tuesday for no apparent reason. But her best friend, Nora Whitfield, had been reassigned upstairs after the incident, the now infamous breakup that had turned a quarterly review into a soap opera, and Cassidy wasn't about to let her suffer alone. "I just think it's absurd," Cassidy said, pouring coffee with the confidence of someone who had never once considered lowering her voice. "A company-wide policy banning relationships because 2 people couldn't act like adults? That's like banning birthday cake because someone once choked on a candle." 3 colleagues stood around the counter, holding their mugs like shields. Nora's eyes widened in a way that clearly meant, "Stop talking." But Cassidy had never been fluent in subtle. "And who decided this?" "The CEO." She waved her hand dramatically. "A man who probably schedules his emotions in quarterly increments. Feelings postponed to Q3. He's controlling, he's bossy, and honestly, nobody has the right to tell people where and when they're allowed to fall in love." She set down the coffee pot and placed both hands on the counter, fully committed. "Have any of you read The Duke's Reluctant Surrender? Because even a fictional 18th century aristocrat understood that love doesn't follow rules. If a duke can figure that out in 1803, surely a modern CEO can manage." The silence that followed was not the kind that comes after a compelling argument. It was the kind that comes before a disaster. Nora stepped on her foot. Hard. "Ow!" Cassidy yelped, spinning toward her. "Have you lost your mind?" "What was that?" If this story is touching your heart, show your support, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Nora grabbed her shoulders and turned her around. And there, standing in the doorway like a man carved from authority and expensive fabric, was Caleb Reed, CEO of Reed & Associates. 6 feet and some unfair extra inches of sharp jaw, dark hair, and the kind of eyes that could make a boardroom fall silent without a single word. He stood perfectly still, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He never came to the break room. Everyone knew that. Caleb Reed had his coffee delivered by his assistant, took it black, and drank it at his desk while reviewing reports that probably made grown men cry. He had no reason to be here. And yet, Cassidy's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her brain, usually so overflowing with opinions, had chosen this exact moment to file for early retirement. "Thank you for the feedback," Caleb said, his voice low and even. "I have some for you as well." He paused. "In my office. Now." He turned and walked away. Cassidy looked at Nora. Nora looked like she was mentally composing a eulogy. The 3 colleagues suddenly found the ceiling very interesting. The walk to his office was the longest 30 seconds of her life. The hallway smelled like oak and ambition. His door was already open, a dark wood frame leading into a room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Everything inside was immaculate, organized, controlled. He pointed to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He took his seat, folded his hands on the polished surface, and simply looked at her. The silence stretched. 1 second, 5, 10, 30. A full minute of nothing but his gaze and the muffled hum of the city below. Cassidy felt heat crawl up her neck, across her cheeks, all the way to the tips of her ears. She dropped her eyes to her lap, then to the desk, then to a perfectly aligned pen that she suddenly wanted to straighten, even though it was already straight. "You wanted to speak with me," she finally managed, her voice 2 octaves higher than usual. "I'm waiting," he said, "for you to repeat your opinion directly to me." She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your feedback. About the policy. About the CEO who schedules his emotions in quarterly increments." The corner of his mouth did not move. "I'd like to hear it again to my face." Cassidy swallowed. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to apologize, grovel, and back out of the room slowly. But Cassidy Whitlock had never once listened to her survival instincts. "Fine," she said, sitting up straighter. "I think you can't prohibit love. I think it's absurd to punish everyone for the mistakes of two people. And I think people have the right to fall for whoever they fall for, even if it's inconvenient." She paused, heart hammering. "Sir." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Then something cracked in his expression. A flicker at the corner of his mouth, a shift in his jaw, and before he could stop it, a laugh. Short, quiet, almost reluctant, as though it had escaped against his will. He pressed his lips together immediately, but the damage was done. Cassidy stared at him, completely bewildered. She had expected fury, a lecture, perhaps a dramatic firing. She had not expected Caleb Reed to laugh. He didn't understand it either. He had walked into that break room for reasons he couldn't quite justify, heard every word she'd said, and fully intended to deliver a measured, authoritative reprimand. But sitting across from this woman, flushed, indignant, passionately quoting romance novels as evidence, something inside his chest shifted in a way that no quarterly report had ever prepared him for. She was, without question, the most absurdly adorable person he had ever encountered. He wanted to squeeze her pink cheeks. He wanted to hear her argue about fictional dukes for another hour, but he was the CEO, and he needed to act like one. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie, restored his expression to its factory settings. "You may go." Cassidy stood on unsteady legs, mumbled something that might have been "thank you" or "sorry," or possibly both at once, and walked out. She closed the door behind her and leaned against the hallway wall, pressing a hand to her chest. Her heart was racing, partly from the terror of being caught, and partly from something else entirely, something she refused to name. Because beyond the fear and the embarrassment, one thought kept circling back, stubborn and uninvited. He was the most beautiful man she had ever seen in her life. Inside the office, Caleb Reed stared at the closed door for far longer than was reasonable. Then he reached across the desk and straightened a pen that was already perfectly aligned. The following Monday, Cassidy arrived at work, determined to forget the entire incident. She had spent the weekend replaying the scene in excruciating detail, in the shower while cooking pasta, at 3 in the morning while staring at the ceiling, and had come to a firm conclusion. She would never set foot on the executive floor again. She would drink her coffee downstairs in her own department, where the machine dispensed something that tasted like regret and burnt rubber, and she would be grateful for it. This resolution lasted approximately 4 hours. At noon, her supervisor appeared at her desk with the kind of smile that meant bad news delivered politely. "Cassidy, there's a strategic project on the executive floor that needs temporary administrative support. You've been selected for the transfer." She stared at him. "Selected by whom?" "Upper management." "Which upper management?" Her supervisor's smile tightened. "The kind you don't question." And so, by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Cassidy Whitlock found herself carrying a box of files and her favorite pen collection to a pristine desk on the presidential floor of Reed & Associates, directly within the gravitational pull of the man she had publicly called bossy, controlling and emotionally quarterly. She was absolutely certain this was punishment. Across the floor, behind a set of frosted glass doors, Caleb Reed reviewed the transfer paperwork with the focused expression of a man who was definitely not smiling internally. His assistant, Marcus Chen, stood beside the desk with his tablet and a look that suggested he had opinions. "So," Marcus began, scrolling through the reassignment form, "out of every administrative employee available for this project, you chose the one who called you a dictator in the break room." "She didn't call me a dictator. She said I was bossy and controlling. Those are different things." "Respectfully, sir, those are synonyms." Caleb straightened a pen on his desk. "She has the highest efficiency rating in the department." "It's a logical choice." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. He had worked for Caleb Reed for 5 years, long enough to recognize when logic was being used as camouflage for something far less rational. He gave it 2 weeks before things got interesting. Cassidy, meanwhile, was trying to survive her first afternoon. The executive floor operated on a different frequency than the one she was used to. Everything was quieter, cleaner, more intimidating. The coffee machine alone looked like it required an engineering degree. People spoke in measured tones. Shoes didn't squeak on the floors. Even the air smelled different, like cedar and fresh paper and the faint, maddening trace of cologne she was trying very hard not to identify. Nora called her during lunch, whispering from 2 floors below. "How is it? Is he there? Can he hear you? Are you being tortured?" "I'm fine," Cassidy said, wedged into a corner near the supply closet. "There's just a project, temporary, a few weeks at most." "Cassidy, the man heard you compare him to a fictional duke with commitment issues." "I said the duke eventually figured it out. That's a compliment." "That is not how he took it," Cassidy groaned. "I just need to keep my head down, do the work, and not say anything remotely opinionated for the duration of this assignment." This, of course, was like asking a river not to flow. By the end of her first day, she had already muttered, "Oh, come on," at her paperback during her coffee break, loudly enough to draw a curious glance from a passing director. She had sighed dramatically at a plot twist while waiting for the printer, and she had, without realizing it, doodled a chain of tiny hearts along the margin of a shipping invoice. She didn't notice. She never noticed. It was as involuntary as breathing. Her hand simply wandered whenever her mind drifted, leaving trails of flowers and hearts on any available surface. Meeting agendas, sticky notes. Once, memorably, on a colleague's tax form, Caleb noticed. He had been walking past her desk, not intentionally, not specifically to check on her, regardless of what Marcus's expression implied, when he caught a glimpse of the document she was working on. Numbers, charts, projections. And in the margins a tiny garden of hand-drawn daisies, surrounding a heart with an arrow through it. He paused for exactly 1 second too long. Cassidy looked up. Their eyes met. She glanced down at the paper, saw the doodles, and turned the color of a ripe strawberry. It's a habit. I'll redo the document." "No need," he said, in a voice so carefully neutral it could have brokered peace treaties. "The numbers are correct. That's what matters." He walked away. Cassidy buried her face in her hands. What she didn't see was the way Caleb paused at the end of the hallway, looked back at her hunched, mortified figure, and allowed himself a private smile that he would deny under oath. By the 3rd day, a rhythm began to form, reluctant, electric, and impossible to ignore. Their paths crossed constantly. The floor was large, but somehow never large enough. She would round a corner, and there he was, adjusting a crooked frame on the wall with surgical precision. He would step into the conference room, and there she was, whispering threats at a fictional character under her breath. He straightened things. She narrated things. They were, in the most fundamental sense, completely incompatible. And yet, Marcus watched it all unfold with the quiet resignation of a man who had seen this movie before and already knew how it ended. He began keeping a mental tally, not of tasks completed or meetings scheduled, but of the number of times Caleb found a reason to walk past her desk. By Thursday, the count was 11. Nora, for her part, had launched a private campaign of redemption. Guilty over the chaos her own failed office romance had caused, and convinced that the universe owed Cassidy a love story, she had quietly appointed herself as matchmaker. Her methods, however, left something to be desired. On Tuesday, she accidentally sent Cassidy to deliver a file to Caleb's office during his lunch break, not realizing he ate alone with the door locked. Cassidy knocked, received silence, knocked again, and eventually slid the file under the door like a secret agent in a movie she would have found romantic if it were happening to someone else. On Wednesday, Nora arranged for Cassidy to attend a meeting she wasn't needed in, hoping proximity would spark something. Instead, Cassidy spent the entire hour trying not to stare at the way Caleb's hands moved when he spoke. Precise, deliberate, distractingly elegant, and left the room having absorbed nothing about supply chain logistics. And on Thursday evening, as the floor emptied and the city lights began to flicker on beyond the glass walls, Cassidy sat at her desk and realized something troubling. She wasn't dreading this transfer anymore. She was, against every ounce of common sense she possessed, starting to look forward to Monday. And 2 doors down, behind frosted glass, Caleb Reed sat at his own desk, staring at a quarterly report he had read 3 times without absorbing a single number, because all he could think about was a woman who argued with books and drew flowers on spreadsheets. He was in trouble. He reached over and straightened a frame that was already perfectly level. Definitely in trouble. Cassidy Whitlock was not a morning person by nature, but she had discovered that arriving early to the executive floor meant 20 blissful minutes of solitude before the world filled with tailored suits and impossible expectations. She could make her coffee in peace, read a few pages of her novel, and mentally prepare for another day of pretending she wasn't hyper-aware of every time Caleb Reed walked within 15 feet of her desk. It was a reasonable system. It worked beautifully. Until a Wednesday morning in her second week, when it all fell apart because of a mug. The break room on the executive floor was immaculate. Granite countertops, a coffee machine that could probably launch satellites, and a cabinet of pristine white mugs that all looked like they'd been selected by a minimalist interior designer. But tucked behind the front row, Cassidy found one that was different. Ceramic, slightly worn at the handle, with a photograph printed on the side. A young man, maybe 17 or 18, pressing a kiss to the cheek of a white-haired woman with the most radiant smile Cassidy had ever seen. She held it up and felt her heart squeeze. There was something impossibly tender about the image. The boy's eyes closed, the grandmother's hand on his arm, the kind of love that didn't need words. Whoever these people were, they were beautiful. She filled it with coffee, added a splash of cream, and carried it to the small table by the window, where she opened her book and took a long, satisfied sip. She was mid-chapter. The heroine had just discovered the Duke's secret library, and Cassidy was whispering, "Finally, you stubborn man," when the door opened. Caleb walked in. His eyes swept the room with their usual efficiency, counter, machine, cabinet, and then landed on her hands, specifically on what was in them. He went completely still. Cassidy looked up. His face had lost all expression, which she was beginning to learn was not a sign of calm, but of something far more intense being held very tightly in check. She followed his gaze to the mug, then back to his face, then to the mug again. The young man in the photograph, the jaw, the dark eyes, the exact angle of that stubborn brow. "Oh no, that mug," she breathed, "was my grandmother's," he said quietly. What happened next would later be described by Marcus, who had the misfortune of walking in at precisely the wrong moment, as the most catastrophic mug-related incident in corporate history. Cassidy lurched to her feet so fast the chair scraped backward. She thrust the mug toward him with both hands like a sacred offering, sloshing coffee over the rim onto her fingers and across the table. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was in the cabinet. I thought it was just... Oh God, I used your grandmother's mug. I'm so sorry." The words tumbled over each other like dominoes in a hurricane. Her cheeks burned crimson. Her hands trembled. She was fairly certain she was experiencing what medical professionals would classify as a shame-induced cardiac event. Caleb reached out and took the mug from her hands. Slowly, deliberately. His fingers brushed hers during the transfer. Warm, steady, lingering 1 heartbeat longer than necessary. The contact sent a jolt up her arm that she absolutely refused to acknowledge. "No one has ever used it before," he said. His voice was even, but something in it had shifted, something she couldn't quite name. He wasn't angry. He looked almost surprised, as though the idea of someone else holding that mug had never occurred to him, and now that it had happened he wasn't sure what to do with the feeling. "I'll clean it," Cassidy offered desperately. "I'll sterilize it. I'll have it blessed by a priest if you want." The corner of his mouth twitched. "That won't be necessary." He turned the mug in his hands, looking at the photograph for a long moment, then set it carefully on the counter. When he looked at her again, his expression had softened, just barely, just enough for someone paying very close attention to notice. "She would have liked you," he said. And then, as if startled by his own words, he straightened his cuffs, nodded once and left the room. Cassidy stood alone in the break room, coffee-stained fingers trembling, heart doing something complicated and inconvenient. Marcus appeared in the doorway, surveyed the scene, the spilled coffee, the empty mug, Cassidy's face frozen somewhere between horror and wonder, and sighed. "You touched the mug." "I didn't know." "Nobody touches the mug." "I gathered that." He shook his head slowly, in the manner of a man watching a train wreck he had predicted in writing. "He carries it home every Friday and brings it back every Monday. It was the last gift his grandmother gave him. He once made a senior vice president cry for moving it 2 inches to the left." Cassidy closed her eyes. "I drank coffee out of it. I heard. Am I going to be transferred to Alaska?" Marcus considered this. If he was going to fire you, you'd already know. The fact that he didn't suggest something much worse. What could possibly be worse? Marcus looked at her with the weary patience of a man who had seen his boss straighten 11 picture frames in a single afternoon. "He likes you." Cassidy opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Before she could form a response, Marcus was gone, and she was left standing in the pristine break room, covered in coffee, clutching her paperback to her chest like a life raft. She returned to her desk in a daze, and there, sitting in the center of her workspace, was a brand new mug. White, simple, clean, and resting against it, a small yellow post-it note in handwriting she didn't recognize but somehow already knew. "So you won't need to borrow anyone else's." She picked it up, turned it over. No signature. She looked toward the frosted glass doors of his office. They were closed as always, but she could swear, absolutely swear, she saw a shadow shift behind them. She sat down, placed the mug carefully beside her keyboard, and pressed her fingers to her cheeks, willing the heat to fade. It didn't. Across the floor, Caleb Reed sat at his desk, pretending to review a merger proposal, while his assistant stood in the doorway with crossed arms and a knowing expression. "A mug," Marcus said flatly. She needed one. "You had one delivered from the shop downstairs in under 20 minutes. Efficiency is a corporate value. You also included a handwritten note." Caleb adjusted a pen on his desk. It was practical information. Marcus stared at him for a long, eloquent moment. "Sir, with the utmost professional respect, you are absolutely lost." Caleb said nothing. Marcus left, and in the quiet of his office, surrounded by perfect order and flawless alignment, Caleb Reed allowed himself to look at the closed door one more time. Something had shifted. He didn't fully understand it yet, but for the first time in a very long time, the most organized man in the building had no idea what to do next. He reached for a frame on the wall beside his desk. It was already straight. He adjusted it anyway. The book vanished on a Tuesday. Cassidy had been reading it during her afternoon break. The Count of Ashworth Manor, the second installment in a series about a brooding aristocrat who was infuriatingly bad at expressing his feelings and spectacularly good at showing up in rain-soaked declarations at the worst possible moments. She had left it on the conference table after being pulled into an unexpected call, and when she returned 20 minutes later, it was gone. She searched the table, the chairs, the shelf by the door. Nothing. She retraced her steps, asked 2 colleagues, checked the lost and found, which on the executive floor consisted of a single drawer containing a forgotten umbrella and a stress ball shaped like a globe. The book had simply disappeared. She mourned it quietly. She was on chapter 19. The Count had just realized he was in love with the governess, and the tension was unbearable. Losing the book at that exact moment felt like a personal betrayal by the universe. The next morning, the book was on her desk. Same copy, same dog-eared pages, same coffee ring on the back cover. But now there was a bookmark tucked precisely where she had left off, a simple strip of cardstock, placed with the kind of care that suggested someone had actually checked which page she was on. And attached to the bookmark, a yellow post-it note. "The Count is irritating, but at least he knows how to make a proper declaration." No signature. Cassidy stared at the note for a full minute. Then she read it again, and once more, just to make sure the words hadn't rearranged themselves into something less impossible. Someone had taken her book, read at least part of it, enough to form an opinion on the Count, and returned it with editorial commentary. She looked toward the frosted glass doors. No, there was no way. Absolutely not. She sat down, slid the note into her pocket. She would examine it later, possibly under forensic lighting, and opened the book to chapter 19, with hands that were only slightly unsteady. She did not mention it to anyone, but she smiled to herself for the rest of the morning, and Nora, who had come upstairs for a quick question that was clearly an excuse to spy, noticed immediately. "You're glowing," Nora accused. "What happened?" "Nothing. Good chapter." "You're a terrible liar, Cassidy Whitlock." She was, but she was also not ready to say out loud what she was beginning to suspect, because saying it would make it real, and real things were terrifying. 2 floors up and behind frosted glass, Caleb Reed was discovering the same problem from the opposite direction. He had not intended to read the book. He had picked it up from the conference table with the sole purpose of returning it to her desk. But the cover had caught his attention, a moonlit manor, a silhouette at the window, and he had opened it purely out of curiosity. Just the first page, then the second, then chapter 1. He had finished it at midnight, sitting in his living room with his grandmother's mug in one hand and a growing sense of alarm in the other, because the Count, arrogant, emotionally constipated, desperately in love with a woman he couldn't bring himself to pursue, was hitting uncomfortably close to home. The post-it note had been an impulse. A reckless, stupid, completely uncharacteristic impulse that he had regretted approximately 3 seconds after placing it, and then spent the entire drive to work convincing himself was merely collegial literary feedback. Marcus had not been convinced. "You annotated her romance novel," Marcus said, standing in the office doorway with the expression of a man watching his retirement savings evaporate. "I left a comment. One comment. On a post-it. About a fictional count's declaration of love. It was a literary observation. Sir, you highlighted the passage where the count says he would cross oceans for the governess." Caleb's jaw tightened. The bookmark slipped. Marcus pressed his lips together so hard they turned white. He nodded slowly, turned on his heel, and walked away without another word, which was somehow worse than anything he could have said. That afternoon, Caleb found something that undid him further. A report had landed on his desk, quarterly projections from the administrative support team compiled by Cassidy. The numbers were impeccable, the formatting was clean, the analysis was sharp and thorough, the kind of work that deserved recognition. And in the margins, nestled between revenue charts and growth forecasts like wildflowers pushing through concrete, were hand-drawn daisies, tiny hearts, a small sun with a smiley face. And in one corner, so faint it was almost invisible, a miniature castle with a flag on top. Any other executive would have sent it back with a reprimand. Any other CEO would have flagged it as unprofessional. Caleb opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one where he kept his grandmother's mug on weekdays, and slid the report inside, face down, beneath a stack of papers that no one else ever touched. He did not examine why he did this. He did not need to. The following week brought a new complication in the form of Grant Holloway. Grant was a senior executive from Whitmore Partners, a company collaborating with Reed & Associates on a joint venture. He was tall, easy with compliments, and possessed the kind of casual charisma that came from never having doubted his own appeal. He wore expensive watches, laughed at his own jokes, and had a habit of touching people's arms when he spoke, as though physical contact were a conversational tool. He also, within approximately 45 seconds of meeting Cassidy, decided she was fascinating. "You work on this floor? I don't know how Reed gets anything done with someone like you around," Grant said during their first meeting, leaning against the edge of her desk with a grin that probably worked on most people. Cassidy smiled politely. "He manages." "I bet he does. Listen, there's a great coffee place around the corner. You should let me take you sometime." "That's kind, but I'm usually busy during breaks." She gestured to the paperback on her desk. "Booked solid, you might say." Grant laughed, as if she had delivered the wittiest line in human history. "A reader. I love that. Beautiful and smart." From across the floor, visible through the glass walls of his office, Caleb watched the exchange with an expression that Marcus would later describe in his private notes as tectonic. He did not move from his desk. He did not say a word, but the pen in his hand bent at an angle that suggested it would not survive the afternoon. "The Whitmore executive is talking to her again," Marcus observed carefully, standing at a safe distance. "I have eyes. He's been leaning on her desk for 6 minutes. I'm aware of the time." He just touched her arm. The pen snapped. Caleb set both halves down with exaggerated calm. "Schedule a meeting with Whitmore's team for this afternoon. Full project review. I want everyone in the main conference room. We had a review last Thursday. Then we're having another one." Marcus paused. "Should I note the agenda item as territorial display disguised as corporate diligence, or would you prefer something more subtle?" Caleb fixed him with a look that could have frozen coffee mid-pour. Marcus nodded. "Conference room, 2 o'clock. I'll send the invites." He walked out, and under his breath, quiet enough to deny, loud enough to mean, he murmured, "He's going to need a bigger drawer." Inside the office, Caleb sat alone, surrounded by perfect order, straight frames, and aligned pens, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. The unpleasant, irrational, completely ungovernable sensation of wanting something he had no logical right to want. He opened the bottom drawer and looked at the report with the daisies. Then he closed it, pressed his palms flat on the desk, and reminded himself, firmly, deliberately, uselessly, that he was the CEO, and she drew flowers on spreadsheets, and none of this was going to end well. Grant Holloway was persistent. That was the charitable way of putting it. The less charitable way, the way Nora put it during a whispered phone call from the second floor, was that the man had the self-awareness of a golden retriever chasing a tennis ball that nobody had thrown. He appeared at Cassidy's desk every time he visited the building, which was becoming suspiciously frequent for someone whose joint venture required, at most, bi-weekly check-ins. He brought her coffee she hadn't asked for. He complimented her outfit, her smile, her handwriting. He once told her she had the most expressive eyes in the building, which she found flattering for about 2 seconds before realizing it sounded rehearsed, like a line from a cologne commercial. She was polite. She was professional, and she was completely, utterly uninterested. The problem was that Grant Holloway didn't seem to register the difference between politeness and encouragement. Every thank you was interpreted as an invitation. Every smile was catalogued as progress. He was, in every sense, harmless, but his presence created a complication she hadn't anticipated, because someone else was watching, and that someone was not handling it well. Caleb Reed had always been possessive about his things: his desk, his chair, his coffee order, the angle of every frame on his wall, the mug that no one touched. These were the anchors of a life built on control and precision, and he guarded them with the quiet intensity of a man who understood that order was the only reliable defense against chaos. But this was different. This was not about objects or routines. This was about the way Grant Holloway leaned too close when he spoke to her, the way his hand drifted toward her arm, the way he made her laugh. Not the real laugh, not the one Caleb had heard when she reacted to her books, unguarded and genuine. A polite laugh, a professional one. But still, it was irrational. He knew it was irrational. She was not his. She was an employee. He had created a rule specifically designed to prevent this exact situation. And yet every time Grant appeared on the floor, something in Caleb's chest tightened like a fist around glass. On Thursday, Grant lingered by Cassidy's desk for 11 minutes. Caleb knew because he timed it on his watch while pretending to read a contract. At the 9-minute mark, Grant placed his hand on her desk, inches from her fingers, and leaned in to say something that made her tilt her head politely. Caleb stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the window. He strode to his office door, opened it, and called across the floor with a voice that carried the weight of executive authority and absolutely no subtlety. "Cassidy, I need you in the conference room. There's an urgent meeting." She looked up, startled. Grant straightened. Marcus, at his own desk nearby, closed his eyes slowly, as though absorbing a blow. Cassidy excused herself and followed Caleb to the conference room. He held the door open. She walked in. He closed it behind them. The room was empty. The whiteboard was blank. There was no meeting agenda, no documents, no indication that anything urgent had ever existed. She turned to face him. "What's the meeting about?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the empty table, looked back at her. "I need you to review a document," he said. "Which document?" "I'll have it sent to your desk." She studied him, the set of his jaw, the faint tension in his shoulders, the way he wasn't quite meeting her eyes. "There's no document, is there?" "There will be." Cassidy bit the inside of her cheek. A suspicion was forming, warm, insistent, entirely too hopeful, and she crushed it immediately. She could not afford to believe that the CEO of Reed & Associates had just invented a fake meeting to pull her away from another man. That was the plot of Chapter 12 in The Count of Ashworth Manor, and real life did not work like romance novels. Except that his ears were slightly red, and she had never seen that before. "I'll wait for the document at my desk," she said, and left the room with her heart beating in a rhythm that felt dangerously close to hope. She did not let herself look back. If she had, she would have seen Caleb standing alone in the empty conference room, hands in his pockets, staring at the door she'd walked through, looking like a man who had just realized that all the control in the world couldn't protect him from this. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Shall I fabricate the document, sir, or would you like to maintain the fiction that it already exists?" A compliance review summary, on her desk by 3. "Of course," Marcus paused. "For future reference, I can schedule standing meetings that would eliminate the need for spontaneous fiction." "That won't be necessary." "It absolutely will be." 2 days later, Cassidy forgot to eat. This was not unusual. When she was absorbed in work, or in a particularly gripping chapter, meals became theoretical. Breakfast was a concept. Lunch was a suggestion she often declined. Her body, unfortunately, did not share her casual attitude toward nutrition. She had been at her desk since 7:30, skipping breakfast in favor of finishing a presentation, then working straight through lunch because the numbers were finally cooperating, and she didn't want to lose momentum. By 2 o'clock, she had consumed nothing but coffee and half a mint she found in her cardigan pocket. At 2:15, the hallway tilted. She stood up to deliver a file to the print room, and the floor shifted beneath her. The walls blurred. Her fingers went cold. She grabbed the edge of her desk, missed, and stumbled sideways into the corridor, where the world went pale and soft and very far away. Caleb found her leaning against the wall outside the supply closet, white as paper, one hand pressed to the wall and the other clutching a folder against her chest like a shield. He was beside her in 3 strides. "When did you last eat?" His voice was sharp, but his hands were gentle, one on her elbow, the other on her shoulder, steadying her. "I had coffee," she murmured. "That's not food." "It's a food group in some cultures." He guided her, practically carried her, through the frosted glass doors and into his office, where he lowered her onto the leather sofa against the far wall. She sank into it, the room still spinning slightly, embarrassment flooding in as the dizziness receded. Caleb moved quickly. Water from the small fridge in the corner. Then he opened a drawer, not the bottom one where he kept the mug and the doodled report, but one higher up, and produced a chocolate bar, dark, expensive, still wrapped. "Eat. You keep chocolate in your desk?" "Emergency provisions." He sat on the edge of the coffee table across from her, elbows on his knees, watching her with an intensity that made the chocolate wrapper crinkle in her trembling hands. She ate, slowly, then with more enthusiasm as sugar hit her bloodstream. The color crept back into her cheeks. The room steadied. She became acutely aware that she was sitting on the CEO's personal sofa, eating his secret chocolate, while he watched her like she might dissolve. "Thank you," she said softly. He leaned back, crossed his arms, rearranged his expression into something appropriately professional. "I can't have employees fainting during business hours. It disrupts the workflow." But his eyes, dark, steady, refusing to leave hers, said something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with workflow and everything to do with the way his pulse had spiked when he'd seen her pale and swaying in that corridor. She held his gaze for one moment too long, then looked down at the chocolate. "This is really good chocolate." "I know. Do you have more?" The ghost of a smile. "Don't push it." She left his office 10 minutes later, steadier but shaken in ways that had nothing to do with low blood sugar. The next morning, a container of fresh pasta appeared on her desk at noon. No note, no explanation. Just a warm meal, perfectly timed, in a ceramic container she had never seen before. The day after that, a salad with grilled chicken and the exact dressing she preferred. The day after that, a sandwich from the bakery 3 blocks away, the one she had mentioned to Nora in passing, in a conversation she was certain no one else had heard. She never found a note. She never saw who left them. But the food appeared every single day, without fail, precisely when she was most likely to forget. She ate every bite, and she stopped pretending she didn't know exactly who was responsible. Eleanor Reed was a force of nature, disguised as a woman in pearls. She arrived at Reed & Associates on a bright Thursday morning, carrying a cashmere scarf and an agenda that had nothing to do with business. At 67, she possessed the kind of effortless elegance that made people straighten their posture when she entered a room, and the kind of perceptiveness that made her son deeply, profoundly nervous. "I was in the neighborhood," she announced, sweeping into Caleb's office with the confidence of someone who owned the building, which technically her late husband had built. "You live 40 minutes away," Caleb said, rising from his desk. Traffic was light. It's rush hour. Eleanor smiled the way mothers smile when they've decided something, and the facts are irrelevant. She kissed his cheek, adjusted his tie, and glanced around the office with appraising eyes. "You need a plant in here. Something alive. This room has the warmth of a courtroom. I like courtrooms. That, darling, is precisely the problem." She stayed for 2 hours. She visited departments. She charmed the receptionist. She told Marcus he looked too thin and insisted on giving him a scone from her handbag. And then on her way to the elevator she met Cassidy. It happened organically, or at least it appeared to. Eleanor pressed the wrong floor button, found herself in the corridor near Cassidy's desk, and struck up a conversation with the warmth and precision of a woman who had been matchmaking since before her son could walk. "What a lovely desk arrangement," Eleanor said, eyeing the small collection of postcards, the well-worn paperback, and the white mug with no design. Are you a reader? Cassidy looked up, startled by the elegant stranger who radiated the same energy as a favorite aunt. I am, yes. Mostly romance, which my colleagues find embarrassing. Romance is the only genre that insists love is worth the trouble. Nothing embarrassing about that. Eleanor extended her hand. Eleanor Reed. Cassidy's eyes widened. She shook the hand with the careful grip of someone who had just realized she was touching royalty. Cassidy Whitlock. I'm temporarily assigned to... Oh, I know who you are. The way she said it, knowing, warm, with the faintest gleam in her eye, made Cassidy's stomach flip. 10 minutes later, they were in the break room, sharing tea and talking about books, families, and the merits of dark chocolate over milk chocolate. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, laughed at Cassidy's stories, and asked the kind of questions that made you feel seen rather than interrogated. When Caleb found them, because Marcus had sent an urgent text reading, "Your mother has found her, conference room, break room, code red," they were laughing together over a story about Cassidy's sister, and Eleanor had her hand on Cassidy's arm like they'd known each other for years. Caleb stood in the doorway, color rising in his neck, wearing the expression of a man who had just watched two worlds collide in the most dangerous way possible. Mother. Darling. Cassidy and I were just discussing how important it is for ambitious men to have someone who challenges them. Wouldn't you agree? Cassidy studied her tea with the intensity of someone searching for the meaning of life in a cup of chamomile. We should let Cassidy get back to work, Caleb said, in a tone that suggested this was not a suggestion. Eleanor stood gracefully. Of course. Cassidy, it was an absolute pleasure. I do hope we'll see each other again. She squeezed Cassidy's hand. Soon. In the elevator, Caleb stared straight ahead. She's wonderful, Eleanor said. She's an employee. She's wonderful, and you know it. Mother, your grandmother would have adored her. The elevator doors opened. Caleb said nothing. Eleanor kissed his cheek, patted his arm, and walked into the lobby with the satisfied stride of a woman whose plan was proceeding exactly on schedule. She appeared twice more that week, then again the following Monday. Always with a reason, dropping off a jacket, returning a book, bringing lunch, and always somehow ending up in a conversation with Cassidy that left both women laughing and Caleb reaching for picture frames to straighten. Marcus started a mental countdown. Then came the gala. The annual company gala was held at a restored ballroom downtown. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, music that drifted through the crowd like silk. It was the one night a year when Reed & Associates shed its corporate formality and allowed its employees to pretend they existed in a world of elegance and champagne. Cassidy almost didn't go. She had 3 dresses hanging on her closet door, none of which felt right, and a growing certainty that spending an evening in the same room as Caleb Reed, while wearing something other than office attire, was a fundamentally dangerous idea. Nora, predictably, would not hear of it. "You're going," Nora declared, zipping Cassidy into a deep emerald gown that caught the light like forest shadows. "You look incredible, and if you don't go, I'll tell your sister about the time you cried over the Duke's letter in chapter 23. That was a beautifully written letter. You sobbed into a pillow for 40 minutes. Cassidy went. The ballroom was stunning. Golden light cascaded from the chandeliers. Clusters of white flowers adorned every table. The orchestra played something old and romantic, the kind of music that made you want to slow down and feel everything. She saw him across the room almost immediately. Black suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a way that was either casual or calculated, and either way devastatingly effective. He was speaking with a group of investors, posture impeccable, one hand holding a glass of something amber. He looked like he'd been designed specifically to make rooms fall silent. Their eyes met. It lasted only a second, a flicker across the crowded ballroom, but it was enough. His gaze traveled over her, from the dark waves of her hair to the emerald that hugged her frame, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition, as though some part of him had always known she would look like this, and was simply confirming what he'd imagined. He looked away first. She exhaled. The evening passed in stages. Conversation. Champagne. Laughter she didn't quite feel. She danced with a colleague, talked to Nora, avoided looking at the corner of the room where she could feel him watching without needing to check. And then the music changed. Something slow, something intimate, the kind of melody that turned a crowded room into a private world. Nora, standing beside her with a champagne flute and a dangerous smile, chose that exact moment to stumble, or perhaps stumble, and nudge Cassidy forward with an elbow that was far too precise to be accidental. Cassidy lurched directly into Caleb's path. He caught her. Reflex. One hand on her waist, the other on her arm, steadying her the way he had in the corridor outside the supply closet, except that this time she wasn't dizzy and he wasn't worried. This time their faces were inches apart, and the music was wrapping around them like a second skin. He didn't let go. "Dance with me." His voice was low, rough, barely above the melody. She should have said no. She knew that. Every rational thought in her body was screaming at her to step back, smile politely and walk away. But his hand was warm on her waist, and his eyes, those dark, impossible eyes, were looking at her like she was the only person in the room. She nodded. They moved together in silence. His hand pressed firmly against her lower back. Her fingers rested on his shoulder, feeling the tension coiled beneath the fabric. The chandeliers blurred. The crowd dissolved. The music became something felt rather than heard. He drew her closer, slowly, inch by inch, as though testing whether she would pull away. She didn't. Their faces drifted together. She could feel his breath against her temple, could smell the warmth of his cologne mixed with something deeper, something that was just him. His jaw brushed her hair. His thumb moved, once, deliberately, against the curve of her waist. She looked up. He was already looking down at her. His gaze dropped to her mouth with a hunger he didn't try to disguise, slow, deliberate, devastating. She saw it, felt it, the desire in his eyes as they traced the shape of her lips. Her breath caught. Her own gaze fell to his mouth, the firm line of it slightly parted, and she bit her lower lip without thinking, leaning closer, drawn by something magnetic and terrifying and absolutely undeniable. The world shrank to the space between their mouths, and then reality crashed in, the music, the chandeliers, the room full of colleagues and investors, and the company name on every wall. She was his employee, he was her CEO. And there was a rule he had made, that stood between them like a wall of glass. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She stepped back. His hand fell from her waist and hung in the air, still shaped around her absence. She turned and walked away, fast, not running, not quite, but close enough that her heels clicked urgently against the marble floor as she crossed the ballroom and disappeared through the doors toward the restroom. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her hands shook. She pressed her back against the cool tile wall and closed her eyes, breathing hard, trying to slow the racing in her chest and failing completely. She had almost kissed the CEO of her company in front of 300 people. And the worst part, the truly terrifying part, was how desperately she wished she hadn't stopped. Back in the ballroom, Caleb Reed stood perfectly still in the middle of the dance floor. His hand was still suspended in the air. Marcus appeared at his side, quiet and careful. "Sir?" Caleb lowered his hand, straightened his jacket, restored his expression to its careful, practiced blankness. "I'm fine," he said. He was not fine. He was not fine at all. Cassidy Whitlock became a ghost. She arrived at precisely 7:50, early enough to settle in before the floor filled, late enough to miss his morning walk past her desk. She ate lunch at her workstation with headphones in, a paperback propped against her monitor like a barricade. She left at 5:30 on the dot, bag already packed, coat already buttoned, as though the building might lock her in if she lingered. She did not go to the break room. She did not wander the corridors. She did not look toward the frosted glass doors. She was, by every measurable standard, a model of professional distance. And she was miserable. The gala replayed behind her eyes on a relentless loop, the warmth of his hand, the way his thumb had moved against her waist, deliberate, possessive, electric, the look in his eyes when they dropped to her mouth. She had felt herself leaning in, felt the pull of him like gravity rearranging itself, and the memory of it made her press her palms to her burning cheeks at 2 in the morning while staring at her bedroom ceiling. It was madness. He was the CEO, she was temporary staff. There was a rule he had written, a rule that existed because of the exact kind of situation she was now drowning in. She would be professional. She would be invisible. She would forget the way his breath had felt against her temple. She was a terrible liar, even to herself. Caleb, for his part, understood the logic of her retreat. It was the correct move, the responsible choice. He should respect it. He respected it for approximately 36 hours. On Monday morning, A coffee appeared on her desk before she arrived. Not from the machine and from the cafe on the corner. A latte with cinnamon. Her exact preference, down to the oat milk and the light dusting of spice on top. She had never told him. She had mentioned it once to Nora in a conversation on the second floor weeks ago. The kind of offhand detail that no one remembered. He remembered. She stared at the cup, picked it up, took a sip, closed her eyes as the warmth and sweetness flooded through her. There was no note. There didn't need to be. On Tuesday, she struggled with the coffee machine in the break room. The executive model, sleek, Italian, temperamental, had decided that today was not a day for cooperation. She pressed buttons. She turned dials. She considered violence. She did not hear him enter. He appeared behind her without warning, one arm reaching past her shoulder to press a small button on the back of the machine. His chest was inches from her back. His breath stirred the hair near her ear. The scent of him, cedar, warmth, something clean and devastating, wrapped around her like smoke. Cassidy stopped breathing. His fingers pressed the button. The machine hummed to life, but he didn't move. For one suspended moment, they stood like that at almost touching, the heat of his body radiating through the narrow gap between them. She could feel her own pulse in her throat, wild and reckless. He closed his eyes. She saw it in the faint reflection of the machine's chrome surface, the way his jaw tightened, the way his lids pressed shut as though he was fighting something enormous, regretting how close he'd come, unable to step away. Then he did. He left the break room without a word. She gripped the counter with both hands and reminded herself to inhale. On Wednesday, Grant Holloway appeared again, freshly confident, bearing 2 cappuccinos and a compliment about her earrings that he delivered while leaning against her desk with the comfort of someone who had never been refused anything. Cassidy opened her mouth to respond, politely, deflectively, the way she always did, when Caleb's office door swung open. "Cassidy," his voice carried across the floor with crisp authority. "I need you in my office, urgent matter." Grant blinked. Cassidy stood, murmured an apology, and crossed the floor to Caleb's office, closing the door behind her. The office was quiet. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, jaw set. "What's the urgent matter?" she asked. He turned, looked at her. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. "I need you to review a compliance document." "The same compliance document from last week? A different one? Is it real this time?" Something cracked behind his eyes. Frustration, embarrassment, and something raw that he couldn't quite suppress. "It will be on your desk by this afternoon." She held his gaze. The romantic inside her, the one who underlined love declarations in novels and cried over fictional letters, was doing cartwheels. But the rational part, the part that had felt the sting of reality on the dance floor, held firm. "You can't keep inventing meetings every time someone talks to me." "I'm not." "You are." His jaw flexed. He looked away, toward the skyline, then back at her. "He was monopolizing your time. He was offering me coffee. You already had coffee." The words came out sharper than he intended, and the second they landed, he realized how they sounded. Possessive, jealous, transparent. Cassidy felt her pulse quicken. The butterflies in her stomach, the ones she'd been trying to starve through distance and discipline, erupted with renewed force. She wanted to believe what his behavior was telling her. She wanted it so badly her chest ached. But she couldn't. Not yet. Because wanting something this much was exactly how people got hurt. "I should get back to work," she said softly. She turned toward the door. Her hand was on the handle when she paused. "The coffee this morning," she said without turning around. "With the cinnamon." Silence. "Thank you." She left. Caleb stood motionless by the window for a long time. Then he sat at his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and looked at the report with the hand-drawn daisies. Marcus knocked and entered with a tablet. "Sir, the Whitmore project meeting is in 10. Also, I took the liberty of placing a new book on her desk." Caleb looked up. "What book?" "The 3rd installment of the series she's been reading. The Count's Redemption." Marcus paused. "I assumed you'd want it done subtly, without a note this time." Caleb stared at him. "You bought her a book." "You were going to. I simply accelerated the timeline." "I didn't authorize that." "Consider it preemptive efficiency." Marcus held his gaze with the calm of a man who had long since stopped pretending. "Sir, with all due respect, you created the rule. You can change the rule. It's not that simple." "It is precisely that simple." Caleb said nothing. Marcus turned to leave. At the door, he paused. She smiled when she saw it, by the way. The book. He glanced back. The kind of smile that made the entire floor go quiet. The door closed. Caleb leaned back in his chair and pressed both hands to his face. He was the CEO of a company that bore his family name. He had built his career on control, precision, and the unwavering belief that discipline was the foundation of success. And he was being completely undone by a woman who argued with fictional characters and drew hearts on quarterly reports. The Whitlock family operated on a philosophy that could be summarized in 4 words: boundaries are for strangers. They arrived on a Friday at noon, Margaret Whitlock leading the charge with a canvas tote bag full of Tupperware, followed by David Whitlock carrying a second bag of backup Tupperware, and finally Lily Whitlock, 23, trailing behind them with her phone raised and recording everything because, in her words, "This content is gold. We called your desk phone and you didn't answer," Margaret announced as they swept through the lobby with the confidence of people who had never once considered that a corporate headquarters might require an appointment. "So we came in person. When did you last eat a proper meal?" "Mom, I'm at work." "You're always at work. That's the problem." Margaret was already unpacking containers on the reception desk, much to the receptionist's alarm. "I made lasagna, garlic bread, that lemon chicken you like, and a salad because your father insisted you need greens." David raised a hand. "For the record, I also brought cookies. Balance is important." Cassidy stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, caught between the mortification of having her family invade her workplace and the deep, involuntary warmth that came from being loved by people who expressed affection primarily through carbohydrates. "You can't just... This is the executive floor. Yeah, there are protocols." "Sweetheart, we took the elevator. It was very straightforward," David said, patting her shoulder. "Nice building. Very clean. The security guard called me sir. I liked that." Lily lowered her phone just long enough to scan the lobby with appraising eyes. "So this is where the magic happens. Where's your desk? Where's the break room? Where's—" She stopped. Her eyes locked onto something over Cassidy's shoulder. Or rather, someone. Caleb Reed had just stepped out of the elevator. He was mid-conversation with Marcus, holding a folder, his stride purposeful and unhurried. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like it had been engineered by someone who understood the precise relationship between fabric and authority. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, a concession to the late afternoon, and his jaw carried the kind of tension that suggested he had just ended a call he hadn't enjoyed. He looked, in summary, exactly like the kind of man who made sensible women forget their own names. Lily's mouth fell open. "Is that him?" she said. Not quietly. Not even close to quietly. In the register that Lily Whitlock considered a whisper, but the rest of the world recognized as a declaration. "Is that the hot boss you never stopped talking about?" The lobby went silent. The receptionist looked up. Marcus stopped walking. 2 employees by the water cooler turned in unison. David Whitlock paused mid-cookie. Cassidy felt the blood drain from her face, rush to her feet, reverse course, and flood her cheeks with a heat so intense she was surprised the fire alarm didn't trigger. "Lily," she hissed. "What? You literally said he was the most gorgeous man you'd ever—" "Lily!" Caleb had stopped walking. He stood 10 feet away, folder in hand, expression unreadable. His eyes moved from Lily to Cassidy to Margaret, who was clutching her lasagna with the frozen expression of a woman calculating whether she could fit inside a Tupperware container, and back to Cassidy. One eyebrow rose, slowly, with devastating precision. And then, against every rule of corporate behavior, against every instinct of the man who scheduled his emotions in quarterly increments, he smiled. Not the controlled half-smile he deployed in meetings. Not the tight professional acknowledgement he offered to board members. A real smile, the kind that softened the sharp lines of his jaw and crinkled the corners of his eyes, and made Marcus inhale sharply, because in 5 years of service he had seen it approximately twice. "You must be Cassidy's family," Caleb said, stepping forward and extending his hand to Margaret with a warmth that caught everyone off guard. "Caleb Reed." Margaret shook his hand, momentarily speechless, a condition so rare her husband later described it as historic. "Margaret Whitlock. I brought lasagna. Would you like some?" "I'd be honored." David shook his hand next, gripping firmly. "David, I'm the father. The protective one, just putting that out there early." "Noted," Caleb said, with a gravity that David respected immediately. Lily extended her hand with the grin of someone who knew exactly what she had just set in motion. Lily, the honest one. So I've gathered. His eyes flickered to Cassidy, who was standing very still and appeared to be breathing through a straw. Your sister speaks highly of the workplace environment here. Lily grinned wider. Oh, she speaks highly of a lot of things around here. Cassidy considered the logistics of relocating to another continent. The visit lasted 45 excruciating minutes. Margaret insisted Caleb try the lasagna. He did, and complimented it with a sincerity that made her beam. David launched into a story about the time Cassidy organized his entire garage by color. Lily provided unsolicited commentary on the office decor, the coffee machine, and the general attractiveness of the executive floor staff, while occasionally glancing at Cassidy with the smile of a sister who knew she had won something permanent. Through it all, Caleb was gracious, attentive, almost gentle. He answered Margaret's questions without condescension, laughed at David's jokes with genuine amusement, and endured Lily's observations with a patience that bordered on saintly, and every few minutes his gaze drifted to Cassidy. She caught it once, twice, 3 times. Each time the look in his eyes was the same, soft, amused, undeniably tender, as though watching her surrounded by the people who loved her most had revealed something essential. Something he wanted to be part of. When the Whitlocks finally departed, Margaret pressing a container of cookies into Caleb's hands with instructions to "Eat properly, young man," David shaking his hand again, Lily winking at Cassidy from the elevator with zero subtlety, the lobby returned to its usual quiet. Cassidy stood in the middle of it, cheeks still burning. "I'm so sorry," she began. "Don't be." Caleb looked at the cookie container in his hands. "Your family is lovely." He paused. "Especially the honesty." She groaned. He walked away before she could see the full extent of his smile. That evening, just before she powered down her computer, a message appeared on her screen. Internal chat from an account she recognized but had never received a message from. Read. "Your family is charming, particularly the sincerity." She stared at it. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed, deleted, retyped, deleted again, and finally settled on Key. "Whitlock, I'm going to change my name and move to another country." 3 dots appeared, then C. Read. "That would be inconvenient. I just learned to make lasagna." She laughed. Alone at her desk in the quiet of the emptying floor, she laughed until her eyes watered and her chest ached, and something tight and frightened inside her loosened just enough to let a sliver of hope slip through. She closed her laptop, gathered her things, and walked to the elevator smiling. And if she pressed her hand to her chest on the ride down, feeling the wild, reckless hammering beneath her palm, she told herself it was just the leftover adrenaline of family-related embarrassment. She almost believed it. Friday arrived carrying the weight of everything unsaid. Cassidy noticed the mug at 5:40. She was gathering her things, coat folded over her arm, bag zipped, book tucked safely inside, when she glanced into the break room and saw it sitting on the counter, alone. The ceramic surface catching the last of the afternoon light, the photograph of a young man kissing his grandmother's cheek, glowing warm against the white granite. He always took it home on Fridays. Always. Marcus had told her it was the one ritual Caleb never broke. The mug traveled with him every weekend, sat on his kitchen counter, and returned Monday morning like clockwork. He had forgotten. She hesitated. Every rational instinct told her to leave it, to walk to the elevator, go home and let someone else handle it. She had spent 2 weeks building walls, arriving early, leaving on time, eating at her desk, avoiding the break room, smothering every flutter of hope before it could take root. She picked up the mug. Her feet carried her down the corridor before her brain could intervene. The floor was nearly empty. The city had begun its golden descent into evening, and the windows along the hallway framed a sky streaked with amber and rose. His door was half open. She could see him standing with his back to her, hands in his pockets silhouetted against the wall of glass. The skyline stretched behind him, towers and light, and the slow pulse of a city settling into dusk. He looked like something from one of her novels, and the thought made her chest tighten. She stepped inside. He didn't turn. "I came to bring your mug," she said, "so you wouldn't forget." Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost fragile. He turned. The man who faced her was not the CEO, not the controlled, immaculate figure who commanded boardrooms and straightened picture frames. This man looked tired, not physically, something deeper, the exhaustion of restraint, of wanting something fiercely and holding himself back from it day after day, until the effort had worn grooves into his composure. He looked at the mug in her hands, then at her face. He crossed the room slowly, each step unhurried, deliberate, closing the distance between them with the gravity of someone who had made a decision he couldn't undo. She tilted her face up to meet his gaze, heart slamming against her ribs. He took the mug from her hands. His fingers wrapped around hers for a moment, warm, steady, before he set it on the desk without looking away from her eyes. Then he came back. His thumb touched her cheek, tracing the curve of it, light as breath, moving downward until it grazed her lower lip. He studied her mouth the way he studied everything, with precision, with focus. But beneath the control, something burned. He looked into her eyes, shy, hungry, surrendered. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The woman who always had something to say, who argued with books, who lectured CEOs, who quoted fictional dukes, stood perfectly silent, undone by the stroke of his thumb against her skin. He smiled, faint, private, the kind of smile that existed only for her. Then he kissed her. It began slowly, a brush of lips, tentative, exploratory, as though he was savoring something too precious to rush. His mouth moved against hers with a gentleness that made her knees weaken. She sighed against him, and the sound broke something open. The kiss deepened. His hand slid to the back of her neck, fingers threading into her hair. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him until no space remained. She grabbed the front of his shirt, fistfuls of fabric, anchoring herself, because the floor had ceased to exist, and he was the only solid thing left in the world. He kissed her like a man who had been holding his breath for weeks and had finally been allowed to exhale. Minutes passed. Hours. She lost count. When they separated, it was only because oxygen demanded it. Their foreheads pressed together. Their breathing came in ragged, uneven waves. His hand trembled against her waist, barely, almost imperceptibly, and that small tremor told her more than any declaration could have. She opened her eyes. He was already looking at her. "Have dinner with me," he said. It wasn't a question, it was barely a sentence. It was the sound of a man surrendering something he had guarded his entire life. She nodded. His thumb brushed her cheekbone one more time. And in the golden light of his corner office, with the city glittering below them, and his grandmother's mug sitting quietly on the desk, the mug that had started everything, the mug that no one was allowed to touch, Cassidy Whitlock realized that she had fallen completely, irreversibly, catastrophically in love with Caleb Reed. The romantic inside her wanted to scream. She kissed him again instead. The restaurant was tucked into a quiet street downtown, low lighting, candles in amber glass, the kind of music that existed only to fill silences that didn't need filling. He had chosen it with the precision he applied to everything, except this time, the precision carried an undertone of nervousness that Cassidy found unbearably endearing. He pulled her chair out before she could reach it, ordered the wine she had mentioned liking weeks ago, a comment made in passing to Nora during a lunch break she didn't think anyone had overheard. The bottle arrived, and when the waiter poured, Caleb watched her face instead of the glass. "You remembered," she said, surprised. "I remember everything you say." He paused as though hearing himself. "That sounds more concerning than I intended." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that crinkled her nose and made her cover her mouth, and something in his expression shifted, softened, like watching a locked door swing open. The conversation began carefully, two people navigating the strange terrain of existing outside the roles they'd worn for months. But the wine helped. The candlelight helped. And the truth was that they had already built something, in post-it notes and borrowed mugs and chapters read in secret, that made the transition feel less like a leap and more like a step they had been walking toward all along. She told him about growing up in a house where the kitchen was the center of the universe and her mother expressed every emotion through food. He told her about boarding school at 12, about learning to keep his world small and controlled, because it was the only way to survive missing home. She told him she'd always wanted to write a novel, but was terrified no one would read it. He told her he'd read anything she wrote. She blushed. He looked away, then back, then at her mouth, then firmly at his wine glass. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said gently. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the strategic silence of the boardroom, something more fragile. He turned the wine glass slowly, the candlelight catching the dark amber liquid. "Her name was Catherine. She raised me more than anyone. My father was building the company, my mother was trying to keep everything together, and my grandmother was the one who actually sat with me. She made hot chocolate on cold mornings. She read to me until I was far too old for bedtime stories, but neither of us wanted to stop." He traced the rim of the glass with his thumb. "She used to say I would meet someone someday who would dismantle every system I built, rearrange everything, make the mess worth it." A pause. His eyes found hers across the candles. "I didn't believe her." Cassidy's throat tightened. "And now?" The corner of his mouth lifted. "Now I think she was the smartest person I've ever known." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his palm up, lacing their fingers together, and held on like she was something he'd been searching for without knowing it. They stayed until the restaurant emptied. He paid over her protests, helped her with her coat, and opened every door between the table and the car with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had studied the blueprints of how to love and was building it by hand. He drove her home, walked her to her apartment door, stood in the narrow corridor with his hands at his sides, and an expression that made her heart feel too large for her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "For tonight. For the wine. For telling me about Catherine." He stepped closer, pressed her gently against the wall beside her door. His hands found her waist, both of them, spanning the curve of her hips, and he leaned down until their foreheads touched. Then he kissed her. Not like the office, not tentative, not exploratory. This kiss knew what it wanted. His mouth moved against hers with slow, devastating intention. One hand slid up her back, pulling her closer. The other cradled her jaw, tilting her face to deepen the angle. She kissed him back with everything she had, fingers in his hair, pulling him down, erasing the last inch of distance between their bodies. One kiss became two. Two became several, each one deeper, warmer, more urgent than the last. His lips traced the corner of her mouth, her jaw, the spot beneath her ear that made her gasp. He returned to her mouth like it was the only place he wanted to be. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, his hands still on her waist and hers still tangled in his collar, the hallway felt sacred. "Good night, Cassidy," he murmured against her lips. "Good night, Caleb." He waited until she was inside, until the lock clicked, until the corridor was silent. She leaned against the closed door, pressed her fingertips to her swollen lips, and smiled like a woman who had finally stepped into one of her own stories. On the other side, Caleb Reed stood perfectly still for 10 full seconds. Then he walked to the elevator, stepped inside, and, alone, unwitnessed, laughed, quietly, helplessly, like a man who had just discovered that losing control was the best thing that had ever happened to him. The quarterly meeting began like every other, department heads in pressed suits, projectors humming, coffee cooling in identical white mugs along the conference table. Cassidy sat near the back, notebook open, pen poised, determined to blend into the furniture. She had barely slept. The memory of his mouth against hers in the corridor outside her apartment had kept her awake until 3, and when sleep finally came, it brought dreams that were worse or better, depending on how honest she was willing to be. She could not look at him, not today. Not in a room full of colleagues who had no idea that their CEO had kissed her senseless against a wall 12 hours ago. Caleb entered at 9 sharp, immaculate, composed, the picture of authority. His eyes found hers in under 2 seconds. She looked away. He didn't. The meeting proceeded through budgets, timelines, and performance metrics. Cassidy took notes she would never read, her handwriting deteriorating into the familiar loops of flowers and hearts she couldn't control. Beside her, Nora sat rigid, radiating the nervous energy of someone who suspected something enormous was about to happen, but couldn't identify what. Then the conversation shifted. A senior manager raised the topic of the relationship policy. Opinions fractured immediately. Some defended it as necessary, others called it outdated. Voices overlapped. Someone cited HR guidelines, someone else cited common sense. Cassidy said nothing. For the first time in her life, she did not trust her own voice. Caleb raised his hand. The room fell silent with the speed of a switch being flipped. He stood. The policy was created to protect the work environment after a specific incident. That was the right decision at the time. His voice was steady, measured, boardroom perfect. But I made an error in assuming every situation would mirror that one. Relationships don't damage companies. A lack of maturity does. He paused. His gaze crossed the room and landed on her with an intensity that made the air between them vibrate. I would be a hypocrite to enforce a rule I can no longer follow myself. Murmurs rippled through the table. Nora's hand found Cassidy's knee under the table and squeezed, because I have fallen in love with someone in this company. The murmurs became silence. Absolute, ringing silence. She might still think I'm bossy and controlling, her exact words in the break room on this floor several months ago. Every head turned toward Cassidy. Her face burned, her eyes stung. But I have never met anyone who believed in love as fiercely as she does. And she was right. About everything. He walked toward her. Slowly. The conference room watched as though the world had narrowed to a single aisle between two rows of chairs. He stopped in front of her. I'm in love with you. And I'm done pretending otherwise. Cassidy's vision blurred. Her chest ached with something enormous and terrifying and wonderful. Nora was crying silently. Marcus, leaning against the far wall, smiled the quiet smile of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded. And from the back of the room, because of course she was there, because Eleanor Reed had never missed a pivotal moment in her life, his mother began to applaud, alone, enthusiastically, without a shred of embarrassment. Cassidy laughed, a wet, broken, joyful sound. You are incredibly bossy, she whispered. I know. And I'm in love with you too. He smiled, the rare one, the real one, and took her hand, lifted it to his lips, pressed a kiss to her fingers, while the room erupted into applause. Marcus raised his pen from the corner like a toast. I definitely deserve a raise. He found her in the corridor after the meeting, the buzz of colleagues still echoing behind them. Have dinner with me tonight. At my place. His voice was steady, but his eyes held something vulnerable, a question wrapped inside a statement, a man offering more than a meal. She smiled. I need to go home first. Get ready. I'll pick you up at 8. The afternoon dissolved in a haze. Nora cornered her in the restroom, demanding details. Marcus passed her in the hallway and murmured, Wear something lovely. She turned crimson and walked into a doorframe. At home, chaos reigned. 3 dresses on the bed, 2 discarded on the floor. She called Lily in panic. Which one, the burgundy, the black, or the ivory? You're asking the sister who got you into this mess. Lily, focus. Ivory. Soft. Romantic. He'll lose his mind. In the background, Margaret's voice rang out. Is it the handsome boss? Tell him I'm sending cookies. Cassidy hung up, laughing and trembling in equal measure. At 8, the doorbell rang. He stood in her doorway in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled, hair slightly tousled, holding a bouquet of white peonies and pale roses. His gaze travelled over her, the ivory dress, the loose waves of her hair, the flush already blooming on her cheeks, and his composure cracked. You're beautiful. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She took the flowers. Their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away. In the car, his hand rested on her knee, warm, anchoring. The city scrolled past the windows in streaks of gold and violet, and the silence between them was full, not empty, but brimming with everything that was about to happen. His apartment door opened, and she forgot how to breathe. Rose petals traced a path from the entrance toward the balcony. Candles of every height lined the hallway, their flames painting the walls in soft, flickering gold. Flowers, arrangements of ivory and blush, perfumed the air. The dining table was set for 2, crystal glasses, wine already breathing, plates that spoke of hours spent in a kitchen by a man who commanded boardrooms but had chosen tonight to command nothing but her happiness. She pressed her hand to her mouth. You said the heroes in your books always know how to make a declaration, he said quietly, standing behind her. I wanted to try. Her eyes glistened. You read my books. Everyone. I took notes. They ate slowly, trading confessions between bites. He admitted he'd nearly set the kitchen on fire twice. She admitted she'd changed her dress 5 times. The laughter came easily. Real. Warm. The sound of 2 people finally allowing themselves to be seen without armor. After dinner, he led her to the balcony. The city shimmered below. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder, and they stood in the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. I've never brought anyone here, he whispered. She turned in his arms, cradled his face in her hands. "Thank you for letting me in." He kissed her, slowly at first, savoring, but there was no goodbye waiting tonight, no locked door, no distance left to cross. The kiss deepened. Her fingers found the buttons of his shirt. He paused, forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." He lifted her into his arms. She laughed, breathless, surprised, radiant, and he carried her down the candle-lit hallway to a room where white sheets glowed like clouds and petals scattered the pillows. He laid her down as though she were something sacred, and in the quiet hours that followed, the man who controlled everything surrendered completely, attentive to every sigh, reverent with every touch, devoted in a way that no novel had ever quite captured. She discovered he was better than any hero she had ever read. He discovered that chaos, when it arrived in the shape of her, was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. The months that followed were the happiest of Cassidy's life, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. Nora said she glowed. Marcus said the entire executive floor had become disturbingly pleasant. Lily sent weekly texts demanding updates with the persistence of a reporter on a deadline, and Eleanor Reed, who had taken to calling Cassidy on Sunday mornings for chats that lasted an hour, and covered everything from recipes to romance novels, told her son with zero subtlety that if he didn't propose soon, she would do it herself. They were official, unapologetically, unmistakably together. He held her hand in the lobby. She left her books on his office shelf. He straightened the frames in her apartment when he visited, and she doodled hearts on the grocery list he kept on the refrigerator. They fit together in the way that opposites sometimes do, not despite the differences, but because of them. The families met on a Saturday evening at Eleanor's home. Margaret brought 3 courses and unsolicited decorating advice. David and Eleanor bonded instantly over a shared love of crossword puzzles and dry humor. Lily charmed everyone, including Marcus, who had been invited because Caleb trusted no one else to manage the logistics of seating 2 families who each believed they were in charge. It was loud, it was chaotic. Caleb straightened 4 picture frames before dessert. He had never been happier. On her birthday, Cassidy expected nothing elaborate. She had told him repeatedly. No fuss, no extravagance, just dinner and maybe cake. He had nodded seriously and said, "Of course." She should have known better. The surprise party was held at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. Both families were there. Margaret already teary, David holding a camera he didn't know how to use, Lily live-streaming from 3 angles, Eleanor positioned strategically near the front with a handkerchief she had clearly brought for a reason. Nora stood beside Marcus, both wearing expressions that suggested they had been co-conspirators for weeks. Cassidy walked in and gasped. Fairy lights, flowers, the faces of everyone she loved gathered in one place, smiling at her like she was the center of the universe. Caleb stood at the far end of the terrace, dark suit, no tie. The look in his eyes, the one that was only ever for her, burning steady and sure. He raised his glass. The room quieted. "I'm not a man of many public words," he began. "Most of you know that, but she taught me that some things deserve to be said out loud." He set the glass down, walked toward her, took her hands. "You taught me that love can't be prohibited, or controlled, or scheduled into quarterly objectives." A ripple of laughter. "It can only be lived." He reached into his pocket, lowered himself to one knee. Margaret sobbed. David fumbled the camera. Eleanor pressed the handkerchief to her eyes, with the dignified composure of a woman who had been waiting for this moment since the elevator. "I want to live it with you. Every messy, beautiful, unplanned day of it, even when you call me bossy." He opened the box. A ring, simple, elegant, perfect, caught the fairy lights. "Will you marry me?" Cassidy's tears fell freely. Her laughter tangled with them, bright and uncontainable. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, deep, joyful tasting of champagne and forever. "And I will absolutely keep calling you bossy." He slid the ring onto her finger. The rooftop erupted. Lily yelled, "I called it!" Nora wept openly. Marcus raised his glass and murmured, "Best event I've ever coordinated." And Eleanor, radiant in the fairy light, whispered to no one in particular, "Catherine would have loved this." She was right. 1 year later, the corner office on the executive floor of Reed & Associates looked different. Not dramatically. Caleb would never allow dramatic. But the changes were there for anyone who knew where to look. A wedding photograph on the bookshelf, silver-framed, catching the morning light. Cassidy laughing, head thrown back, and Caleb looking at her the way he always did, like the rest of the world was a footnote. Beside it, the ceramic mug with the photograph of a boy kissing his grandmother's cheek, now sharing the shelf with a second mug, white, simple, well-loved, that had started as an apology and become a symbol. And in the top drawer of the desk, tucked beneath the quarterly reports, a crayon drawing of two stick figures holding hands under a lopsided rainbow, signed in wobbly letters by his niece, Sophie, who had declared at the wedding that Uncle Caleb smiled, "Way more now," and she approved. The bottom drawer still held the original report with the hand-drawn daisies. He had never moved it. Cassidy entered without knocking, as she always did. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the soft cream sweater she wore or the way her hair fell loose around her shoulders. It was something deeper, a fullness, a warmth that seemed to emanate from her like light from a window. "The baby kicked," she said. Caleb was on his feet before the sentence ended. He crossed the office in 3 strides, hands reaching for her, his expression shifting from CEO to something infinitely softer. He placed both palms against the gentle curve of her belly, fingers spread wide, and waited with the focused patience of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, but perfectly willing to surrender this one. A flutter, faint, but unmistakable. His eyes shone. "This one is going to be stubborn," he murmured. "Like the mother. Or bossy. Like the father." He laughed. The real laugh, the one she had unlocked that first day in his office when she'd stood before him, flushed and defiant, quoting romance novels as constitutional law. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, slow, tender, the kind of kiss that held 1,000 others inside it. Marcus appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, expression carefully neutral. "The 2 o'clock is in 5 minutes. Also, Eleanor called. She wants to know if the nursery will be sage green or lavender, and she says, and I quote, 'If you let that child grow up without hot chocolate traditions, I will intervene.'" "Tell her sage green," Cassidy said. "Tell her we'll call tonight," Caleb added. Marcus nodded, turned and paused. He looked at them, the CEO with his hands still on his wife's belly, the woman who had once called him a dictator standing in his office like she owned it, which in every way that mattered, she did. "For the record," Marcus said, "I believe my performance review should reflect the significant role I played in this entire situation." "You bought her 1 book," Caleb said. "I bought her the right book. Timing is everything." He disappeared down the hall. Cassidy leaned into Caleb's chest. He wrapped his arms around her, chin resting on top of her head, and they stood in the quiet of the office that had witnessed their entire story, from the first mortified silence to the last surrendered kiss. "I need to show you something," she said. She took his hand and led him down the corridor to the break room, the same break room where, months ago, she had stood before a group of wide-eyed colleagues and declared that no one had the right to prohibit love. The old policy sign was gone. In its place hung a new one framed in simple wood, printed in clean black letters. "If it's true love, notify HR, they love a good story." Beneath it, in smaller script, suggested by the CEO's wife. Caleb stared at it, looked at her, looked back at the sign. "You're impossible," he said. "You married impossible." He pulled her close and kissed her in the exact spot where everything had begun, where a woman with a sharp tongue and a romantic heart had spoken too loudly, believed too fiercely, and changed the life of a man who thought he had everything under control. The mug sat on the shelf above them, the boy and his grandmother frozen in their eternal kiss. Some loves, it turns out, can't be contained by rules. They can only be lived. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.